The Syrian war has raged on for years, and there's a lot going on. Let's break it down. For 40 years, the Assad family and a handful of elites ruled Syria as a secular state. They ran Syria's only political party, the Ba'ath Party, and are members of a Muslim group called Alawites, part of the Shia minority in this majority Sunni country. In 1963, the regime imposed what became a permanent state of emergency. This allowed the secret police, the Mukhabarat, to detain anybody at any time without charge. Long before the war, jails were filled with political prisoners, and countless Syrians had been taken, tortured, and disappeared. By early 2011, Arab Spring demonstrations were erupting in and around the Middle East. In March that year, some teenagers in Daraa were arrested and tortured for spraying an anti-Bashar al-Assad slogan on the wall of their school. Unarmed demonstrators demanded the boys' release, but Assad's forces responded violently. Word spread, and within days, people began organizing local committees to coordinate protests across the country. They demanded an end to the state of emergency, the release of political prisoners, and an end to economic inequality. Assad blamed the unrest on criminal gangs of foreign conspirators, saying, "Terrorists are loose on the streets." But he did eventually make some changes. He fired his cabinet and the governor of Daraa and appointed new ones. The Ba'ath Party also allowed new parties to run in the parliamentary elections, on the condition that his party handpicked the candidates. And finally, Assad declared an end to the state of emergency. But the next day, he replaced it with a new, even stricter set of laws against protesting. A turning point came when thousands gathered in Homs on the city's main square under its clock tower. They vowed to stay all night and set up tents, much like other protests of the Arab uprising in the region. At dawn on April 18th, security forces stormed the square, killing dozens. That was the tipping point. Homs became known as the capital of the revolution. A series of unarmed protests for reforms started to become a fight to end the regime. Pro-Assad militias, called Shabiha, started to get traction. In response, peaceful demonstrations now became violent. Some soldiers refused to fire on protesters and defected from their units in the Syrian Arab Army and joined the local self-defense militias to form what is now known as the Free Syrian Army. Hundreds of different brigades sprung up, each acting individually to protect its area from Assad's forces. At the time, they all called themselves FSA. As more military defectors moved into neighborhoods and towns, the FSA grew and began to make gains. Assad's forces retreated from some areas. In these liberated territories, the local coordinating committees evolved into local councils. For the first time in generations, Syrians elected their own leaders. They coordinated with civil society and activists in exile and formed the National Coalition of Revolutionary and Opposition Forces, known as the Ettilaf. They intended to form an interim government when the regime was removed, which they expected would be soon. By February 2012, almost 8,000 people had already been killed as the violence spread. Syria's neighbors reacted. The Arab League proposed a de-escalation plan to calm things down. Assad agreed and allowed a team of observers into Syria. They reported seeing tanks on the streets of major cities and no slowing to the violence. So the Arab League suspended its monitoring mission and voted to cease recognizing Assad as a legitimate leader, eventually granting Syria's seat in the Arab League to the Ettilaf. Assad's forces were weak and losing ground to the opposition. Nearly half of the 220,000-strong Syrian army had defected and joined the rebellion along with top officials. Even the prime minister, Riyad Hijab, defected. But Assad insisted he would not step down. Both sides reorganized. The opposition were emboldened by support from several countries who formed the Friends of Syria coalition. They backed the Ettilaf and gave light weapons to the opposition, but without heavy artillery or anti-aircraft weapons, they were still outmatched. On Assad's side, Iran sent weapons and soldiers to rescue the Assad regime from collapse. Iran, a Shia majority country, also supported fighters from the Lebanese group Hezbollah, who entered Syria at Assad's invitation to help his forces put down the uprising. The brewing war was also starting to attract foreign fighters and militias. Assad incorporated Alawite militias into his paramilitary force called the National Defense Force, run by Iran's top general. On the other side, Despite political and cultural differences within the FSA, at the onset, the opposition was united in fighting for the same cause, to replace Assad's regime with a democratic state for all Syrians. But that didn't last. The FSA began to fracture. Taking advantage of the power vacuum, members of Al-Qaeda began pouring into Syria, calling themselves Jabhat al-Nusra. Separately, another party to the war had appeared in the north of the country, the YPG militia, looking to carve out an autonomous region in Syria and in neighboring Iraq. The YPG is the Syrian branch of the PKK, a designated terrorist group by the US, EU, and Turkey. By the end of 2012, they were entrenched in the north and not in confrontation with the regime. So at this point, 4 groups were competing for power in Syria: Assad's forces, the FSA, Al-Qaeda-linked groups, and the YPG. 3 events then changed the balance of force in the war. On August 21, 2013, Assad's forces bombed a civilian area in Damascus with sarin, a deadly nerve toxin. 1,400 people in 12 neighborhoods in eastern Ghouta were killed. In the words of then US President Barack Obama, Assad had crossed a red line.
A red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized.
And US military action was now on the table. But Obama held off attacking when Russia brokered a deal on behalf of the regime. Assad agreed to give up his stockpile of chemical weapons, but numerous investigations since then have shown he was lying. Many opposition groups saw the failure of the US to act as a huge betrayal. Then, in 2014, another major development: new players entered the war. That July, a breakaway faction of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, calling itself Islamic State, also known as Daesh, proclaimed a Muslim caliphate in the region and declared war on anyone who opposed them, Muslim or not. Daesh quickly spread out of Iraq into Syria, aiming to overthrow Assad and replace him with the organization's so-called caliph, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Daesh was well equipped and soon occupied large parts of Iraq and Syria. But many other opposition groups rejected their vision of an Islamic State and fought against them. Even the Al-Qaeda-linked Jabhat al-Nusra would distance themselves from them. One group fighting Daesh was the YPG, which made gains with US support. Because of the YPG's terrorist links, US support for the group infuriated Turkey, which was the biggest backer of the FSA. In response to Turkey's concerns, the US formed the SDF, or Syrian Democratic Forces. But it was only a change in branding. The YPG dominated the SDF, although other groups were a part of it. The third event to change the tide of the war was Russia's role. In late 2015, Russia rapidly escalated its military involvement. You see, up until that point, Russia had backed up Assad using diplomatic and political means, but it now entered Syria with its air force. Russian President Vladimir Putin said his country was going after Daesh, but according to the US State Department, 90% of their airstrikes targeted areas held by the opposition groups, in particular the Turkey-backed FSA. They weakened the resistance to Assad and left other groups to fight Daesh. 3 strategies characterized Russia's support for Assad. Besiege. The regime blocks all access to an area. People, food, medicine, and supplies can neither enter nor exit. Bomb. The regime and Russian air forces relentlessly bomb an area until there is little to no resistance left. Evacuate. After enough international pressure, the regime opens up avenues for survivors to leave. Using these strategies, pro-Assad forces regained control of many towns and cities, most notably Aleppo. Russia's military intervention also weakened the FSA, allowing the regime, the YPG, and Daesh to strengthen. Turkey reacted to this new threat. It entered northern Syria together with the FSA to clear out Daesh and YPG from its borders. It also set up safe zones in support of local administrations. When the regime bombed Khan Sheikhoun with chemical weapons, President Trump ordered the first US airstrike against the regime, targeting the base where the chemical attack was launched. At the same time, Iraq and Syrian regime opposition forces had finally turned the tide against Daesh and were driving them out of the cities and towns. In Syria, the US-backed SDF defeated them in Raqqa, the de facto Syrian capital of their so-called caliphate. The BBC would later report that the SDF allowed around 4,000 Daesh militants with weapons, including high-level officials, to escape, and even provided them with transport out of the city. Within a month, Daesh was a spent force in urban areas in Syria. In early 2018, Turkey again entered Syria, this time targeting the YPG in Afrin. And as if to highlight the fluidity of alliances in this ever-shifting war, this time Assad, not the US, came to the YPG's defense. So where are we now? Over 500,000 Syrians have been killed and over 10 million have been displaced. Assad has regained control of the most important cities and territories in the country, with various other groups holding on to the enclaves they had carved out. Large swaths of infrastructure have been leveled. Local and international players are still jostling to secure their interests in what will be left of the country. 3 peace processes in Geneva, Astana, and Sochi have secured little. So peace itself is something of an illusion, even if at times there's a lull in the fighting. The people of Eastern Ghouta are still living through one of the longest sieges in modern-day history. What will the coming years bring? And what kind of future can we imagine for Syria?